What do Trump's imposed tariffs mean for global climate action?
The announcements and what has gone out there in the public space is truly seismic. We're talking about almost like a once in a century or once or twice in a century change to global trade patterns that is going to be forced as a result of these tariffs. It is hard to overstate just how seismic an impact we are talking about. And to put that into perspective, for some countries, this is going to be crippling. Again, uses that word in a very considered way. I mean, Lesotho, for example, is looking at its entire textile industry being eviscerated, like just ramped down, basically, having benefited from preferential trade status by virtue of being one of the poorest countries on earth. They've managed to build a local denim industry, exporting to companies like Levi's and Wrangler and others. And now it's just not viable because of the scale of the tariffs that have been put on them. The other thing, I guess, is that it is also unclear whether this is an opening gambit to force negotiation. And actually, there's a lot of indications that the administration in the US is now looking to negotiate from this very hard position based on what countries come back to them with in terms of incentives, sweeteners, and so on.
But what does it mean for, I don't know, your supply chains as well as sustainability at the end of the day?
Reducing emissions seems like a super micro problem right now in this context, even though it is a super macro problem in every context. It looks like the desired outcome from this tariff regime is to onshore manufacturing capacity. The US has historically been going towards offshoring capacity into emerging markets. And now this tariff regime is basically kind of saying we really want to bring this back onshore. And this may or may not trigger similar momentum in Europe and elsewhere where everyone's trying to kind of onshore some of these capabilities. And then I think what starts to get interesting is to say, well, what does that mean in terms of global emissions? And is it more likely that manufacturing emissions might go down because Europe and arguably even the US are on a more robust trend to reducing their emissions than some of the other countries? Like it's arguably much harder to decarbonize, potentially Lesotho, I'm not sure, but potentially than Germany, for instance, or the UK, or countries which already have a lot of the supporting infrastructure, regulatory frameworks, incentives to invest in energy transition. So that's kind of one argument that actually this might reduce emissions. I don't think that argument will resonate much with a lot of sustainability professionals who are, I would imagine, quite sympathetic to the countries that they're sourcing from and the economic development arguments on the other side, which are undeniably strong. At the same time, like what happens in these other countries, you kind of sort of decimate local suppliers, local supply chain ecosystems. What does that do to the economy? What does that do to the appetite to focus on other pressing issues such as climate change mitigation? I think that appetite collapses because right now every country in the global south is thinking about how to navigate this new challenge rather than the challenge of 1.5 degrees.
Yeah, domestic production ultimately in a lot of places will actually just drive up costs because a central tenet of global trade is that nations focus on making goods where they have competitive markets. So Brazil specialize in coffee production because they've got favorable climatic conditions to coffee, for instance. So what does that mean for the consumer and what does that mean for business who are then having to relocate and find domestic industries for this where they haven't had to? I mean, in the UK, for instance, we have completely tried to push down those kind of industries and become more of an importing country.
Yeah, I mean, the Pareto principle has been well established really in the corporate world and in just the global trade narrative, which is countries should do what countries are good at and companies should do what companies are good at and assume that actually as long as everyone does that, everyone is most efficient. One interesting example, for instance, that I look at is most vanilla is sourced from a few countries like Madagascar. And that's because of two things. One is that the climate conditions are appropriate, and also the vanilla has to be manually pollinated, which means that you have to have very cheap labor doing that. The US is undeniably unsuited to growing vanilla, both from a climate perspective and also from a labor price perspective. But the tariffs don't recognize that. And so if you have these massive tariffs on vanilla exporting countries, Is the US prepared to hike the price of vanilla ice cream and all the other stuff that has vanilla in it, or try and produce local synthetics? It's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
And what does that do to the vanilla industry?